Imagine standing 10 feet from liquid metal hot enough to vaporize bone, 2,900 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the temperature of molten steel inside a Bessemer converter. And in the mills of Pittsburgh, Gary, and Bethlehem, men stood close enough to feel their eyebrows singe, close enough that a single splash meant death. Not quick death either, the kind where doctors counted the hours while your family waited outside. This wasn't some rare occurrence. This was Tuesday. This was every single shift for hundreds of thousands of American workers across 5 decades of industrial expansion. And the men who survived long enough to retire? Their life expectancy was 10 to 15 years shorter than the average American. The steel industry didn't just use these men, it consumed them. So today, we're going inside the open hearth furnaces and Bessemer converters that built modern America. We're going to stand where those workers stood, feel what they felt, and understand why the greatest industrial achievement in human history was also one of its greatest crimes against working men. This is the story of American steel, and it begins with a sound that witnesses described as a volcanic eruption. The year is 1856, and an English inventor named Henry Bessemer has just solved a problem that engineers had struggled with for centuries. How do you remove impurities from pig iron fast enough to make steel production economically viable? His answer was elegant and absolutely terrifying. You blow cold air directly through molten iron at extreme pressure. The oxygen in the air combines with carbon and other impurities, and burning them off in a violent chemical reaction that raises the temperature of the metal by several hundred degrees without any additional fuel. The Bessemer converter looked like a massive egg made of steel plate, lined with heat-resistant brick, mounted on pivots so it could tilt to pour. It stood about 20 feet tall and held between 10 and 20 tons of molten iron at a time. When the air blast hit that liquid metal, the converter erupted. Flames shot 30 feet into the air. Sparks cascaded in every direction like fireworks from hell. The roar was so loud that workers communicated through hand signals because no human voice could penetrate that wall of sound. Witnesses who observed the process for the first time often compared it to standing at the edge of an active volcano. The only difference was that this volcano erupted on command, multiple times per day, inside a building, and men worked beside it. The Bessemer process transformed steel production. What once took days could now be accomplished in 15 to 20 minutes. A single converter could produce more steel in one shift than a traditional crucible furnace could make in a month. But that speed came with consequences. When air blasted through molten iron, the reaction was violent and unpredictable. Molten metal didn't just sit there passively. It danced. It leaped. It threw sparks and droplets of liquid steel in every direction. Workers called these eruptions heats, and every heat was a gamble with your body. The men who operated Bessemer converters developed an instinct for the machine's moods. They learned to read the color of the flame, which shifted from orange to white as carbon burned off. They learned to hear subtle changes in the roar that indicated the reaction was nearly complete. They learned which positions around the converter were statistically safer than others. But no amount of experience could make the job safe. A worker named John McBride described his first day at a Pittsburgh converter in 1887. He wrote that he had never imagined such a thing could exist on Earth. The heat was so intense that his clothes felt like they might ignite from 30 feet away. When the converter blew, he dove behind a support column because sparks were landing on his skin and burning through his shirt. His foreman laughed and told him he would get used to it. McBride lasted 6 years before a splash of molten steel took his right arm. The protective equipment available to these men would be laughable today. Leather aprons, wooden clogs with metal plates, tinted goggles that fogged with sweat within minutes, gloves that lasted maybe a week before the heat dried them to cracking leather that fell apart in your hands. Burns were so common that most steel mills had dedicated burn wards, not first aid stations. Actual hospital wards, staffed by doctors who specialized in treating thermal injuries. A man might work a 12-hour shift with second-degree burns on his forearms and be expected to return the next day. Third-degree burns that would hospitalize a modern worker were treated with lard and bandages, and the man was back at his post within a week. The hierarchy inside a Bessemer plant was determined largely by how close you worked to the converter. The lowest paid laborers stood farthest back, shoveling coal and hauling materials. The highest paid men stood closest to the molten steel, controlling the pour and monitoring the reaction. They earned more because they died faster. But the Bessemer converter was only part of the story. By the 1870s, a new technology was emerging that would eventually surpass it: the open hearth furnace. If the Bessemer converter was a bomb, the open hearth furnace was a slow-burning crematorium. It accomplished the same basic transformation of pig iron to steel, but over 8 to 12 hours instead of 15 minutes. That sounds safer. It wasn't. The open hearth furnace was essentially a giant brick-lined chamber, shaped like a shallow swimming pool, heated by burning gas or oil at one end. Workers fed scrap iron and pig iron through doors in the furnace wall, then watched as the metal slowly melted and purified over the course of a shift. Periodically, they had to test the metal, which meant opening those doors and reaching into the furnace with long iron rods to collect samples. Every time those doors opened, workers were blasted with heat that exceeded anything a Bessemer plant could produce. The furnace interior glowed white. The air shimmered so violently that it was difficult to see. Men working the doors wore multiple layers of clothing soaked in water, and the outer layers would begin to steam and smoke within seconds of exposure. The open hearth furnace could hold anywhere from 50 to 500 tons of metal, depending on its size. The largest ones were industrial cathedrals, stretching hundreds of feet long with ceilings high enough to accommodate massive overhead cranes. These cranes moved ladles of molten steel from the furnaces to the casting floor, swinging loads of liquid metal that weighed more than a locomotive over the heads of workers below. When a ladle failed, and they did fail, the results were catastrophic. Molten steel doesn't splash like water. It has the viscosity of warm honey. And when it lands on a human body, it clings. It doesn't roll off. It sticks and burns straight through skin, muscle, and bone, while the victim tries desperately to tear it away with hands that are themselves on fire. In 1909, a ladle crane at Southworks in Chicago suffered a mechanical failure while carrying 80 tons of molten steel. The ladle tipped, the steel poured, 14 men died. Some were killed instantly. Others survived the initial pour, only to die over the following days as their burns became infected or their organs failed from shock. A 15th man, whose name has been lost to history, survived with burns over 70% of his body. Records indicate he lived for another 2 years. Though what kind of life that was, we can only imagine. Accidents like this were not anomalies. They were statistics. In 1910, the Bureau of Labor Statistics estimated that American steel mills killed approximately 195 workers per 100 million hours worked. That doesn't sound like much until you do the math. The industry employed several 100,000 workers, each working 3,000 or more hours per year. The actual body count was staggering. Carnegie Steel alone reported 46 deaths and over 2,600 serious injuries in a single year at just one of its Pittsburgh facilities. That's 1 death per week and 14 serious injuries per day. Every day, all year long. And Carnegie Steel had a reputation as one of the better managed operations. Smaller mills with less capital for safety equipment had worse records. The men who survived the physical dangers still faced an invisible enemy. The air inside a steel mill was a toxic soup of coal smoke, metal dust, and chemical fumes. Pittsburgh earned its nickname, the Smoky City, because the pollution from its mills was so thick that the sun often disappeared behind a permanent gray haze. There are photographs from the 1890s showing Pittsburgh at noon, and you would swear they were taken at dusk because the sky is so dark. Workers breathed this air for 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. Many of them lived within walking distance of the mills, which meant they breathed it during their off hours too. Their houses were coated in soot. Their wives complained that laundry hung out to dry would be dirtier than when it went up. Children played in streets where the air tasted like metal. The medical consequences took decades to fully understand. Respiratory diseases killed steel workers at rates far exceeding the general population. Lung cancer, which was relatively rare in the 19th century, appeared with disturbing frequency among retired steelmen. Heart disease struck earlier and more aggressively. A 50-year-old steel worker had the cardiovascular system of a 65-year-old accountant. And none of this was acknowledged by the companies that employed them. When workers got sick, they were simply replaced. When they died, their widows received maybe a month's pay if the company was feeling generous. There was no workers' compensation, no disability insurance, no pension. A man gave the steel industry the best years of his life, and when he was used up, he was discarded like slag. But to understand how this system was allowed to exist, you need to understand the economics of steel. And for that, we need to talk about Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie arrived in America as a poor Scottish immigrant in 1848. He was 13 years old. His family settled in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, and young Andrew went to work as a bobbin boy in a cotton mill, earning $1.20 per week. 50 years later, he was the richest man in the world. The standard biography of Carnegie emphasizes his genius, his vision, his philanthropic gifts to libraries and universities. What it tends to minimize is the human machinery that made his fortune possible. Carnegie didn't invent steel. He didn't invent the Bessemer converter or the open hearth furnace. What he invented was a system of labor extraction so efficient and so brutal that it made American steel cheaper than any competitor on Earth. Carnegie's insight was simple. Steel production is fundamentally a labor cost problem. The raw materials, iron ore and coal, are cheap. The technology is expensive to build but lasts for decades. The variable that determines profit is how much steel you can get out of each worker, per hour, per dollar of wages paid. So Carnegie drove his workers relentlessly. 12-hour shifts were the minimum. 14 hours was common. During demand surges, men worked 18-hour shifts and slept in the mill rather than walk home. The work week was 7 days. Not 6, 7. The only days off were July 4th and Christmas, and even those were eliminated during production crunches. Wages were kept as low as the labor market would bear. Carnegie employed a sophisticated intelligence network to monitor union activity, and he crushed organizing attempts with a combination of firings, blacklists, and when necessary, violence. His managers were instructed to set production quotas that required workers to maintain a punishing pace throughout their shifts. Men who slowed down were docked pay or dismissed. The result was extraordinary productivity. Carnegie's mills produced more steel per worker than any operation in the world. His costs were so low that he could undercut British steel manufacturers even after shipping his product across the Atlantic. By 1892, Carnegie Steel was producing more steel than all of Great Britain combined. But that productivity came from the bodies of his workers. They were being used faster than they could be replaced. And in July of 1892, they tried to fight back. The Homestead strike began as a labor dispute over wages at Carnegie's flagship plant in Homestead, Pennsylvania. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, a union representing over 24,000 skilled workers, had a contract that was about to expire. Carnegie's lieutenant, Henry Clay Frick, announced that the new contract would include substantial wage cuts and changes to work rules that would increase the pace of production. The workers refused. Where Frick locked them out, then he hired 300 agents from the Pinkerton Detective Agency to come to Homestead and break the strike. What happened next was one of the bloodiest labor confrontations in American history. The Pinkertons arrived on barges, floating up the Monongahela River in the pre-dawn darkness of July 6th. The workers had been warned. They gathered on the riverbank with rifles, shotguns, dynamite, and a cannon that someone had found in a local armory. When the barges tried to land, the workers opened fire. The battle lasted 14 hours. The Pinkertons, trapped on their barges, were systematically shot to pieces. Workers set fire to oil that had been poured on the river, sending walls of flame toward the boats. They rolled a burning railroad car toward the landing point. They fired the cannon, though it mostly missed. By the time the Pinkertons surrendered, 7 workers and 3 detectives were dead. Dozens more on both sides were wounded. The surrendering Pinkertons had to run a gauntlet of furious workers who beat them with fists, clubs, and pieces of metal as they staggered toward town. Several nearly died from their injuries. But the workers' victory was short-lived. The governor of Pennsylvania called out the state militia. 8,000 soldiers occupied Homestead. The strike leaders were arrested and charged with murder, though none were ultimately convicted. Strikebreakers were brought in to restart production. Within 4 months, the union was broken. The Amalgamated Association never recovered. Union membership across the steel industry collapsed. For the next 40 years, steel workers would have essentially no collective bargaining power. Carnegie had won. And where was Carnegie during all of this? On vacation in Scotland. He had left Frick in charge specifically so that he could have plausible deniability about whatever methods were necessary to break the union. When the violence made international headlines, Carnegie expressed his shock and dismay from the comfort of his castle. He never took responsibility, he never changed his practices, and he never stopped profiting from a system that killed and maimed thousands of workers every year. 10 years later, in 1901, Carnegie sold his steel empire to J.P. Morgan for $480 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $16 billion in today's money. Carnegie spent the rest of his life giving away his fortune to libraries, universities, and peace initiatives. He is remembered as one of history's great philanthropists. The men who made that fortune possible, who died in his mills or lived shortened lives with broken bodies, they are not remembered. They have no libraries named after them. Their names appear only in accident reports that were filed and forgotten. They were the fuel that powered American industrialization. And like all fuel, they were consumed without sentiment. The steel industry didn't improve its safety record because owners developed a conscience. It improved because workers organized, went on strike, and forced change through collective action. It improved because journalists exposed conditions that the public found unacceptable. It improved because government regulators, after decades of industry resistance, finally imposed minimum safety standards. But before that improvement came, there were the decades of horror. Let me tell you about some of the men whose deaths we actually know something about. In 1897, at Jones and Laughlin Steel in Pittsburgh, a Hungarian immigrant named Janos Kovács was working the pouring floor when a ladle tilted unexpectedly. Witnesses said he had perhaps 2 seconds to react. He ran, but molten steel is faster than any man. It caught his legs below the knee. His co-workers pulled him away, but the damage was catastrophic. Both legs were burned to the bone. Kovács died 3 days later in the company hospital in what the attending physician described as unimaginable agony. He was 26 years old. He had been in America for 18 months. Kovács left behind a wife and 2 children in Hungary. They had been waiting for him to save enough money to bring them over. Instead, they received a letter from a priest explaining that Janos was dead and that the company had graciously provided $20 for burial expenses. $20. That was the value the steel industry placed on a human life. In 1903, at Bethlehem Steel in Pennsylvania, a charging machine operator named Antonio Rossi was feeding scrap metal into an open hearth furnace when the charge shifted. This was a known hazard. Scrap metal piles could be unstable, and if they collapsed at the wrong moment, they could push a man into the furnace opening. That's exactly what happened to Rossi. The scrap shifted, knocked him off balance, and he fell forward into the mouth of the furnace. The men who worked beside him said they could hear him screaming for perhaps 5 seconds. Then silence. There was no body to recover. The furnace operated at temperatures that would reduce bone to calcium powder. Antonio Rossi simply ceased to exist, consumed by the machine he had operated for 3 years. He was 31. His wife was pregnant with their 4th child. These were not unusual deaths. They were typical. Every major steel plant had stories like these, and most of those stories were never recorded. The men who died were overwhelmingly poor. Many were immigrants who spoke little English. Their deaths were noted in company ledgers as production disruptions, not human tragedies. If a family wanted compensation, they had to hire lawyers and prove negligence in courts that were heavily biased toward industry. It made up the majority of the workforce in American steel deserves particular attention because immigrants made up the majority of the workforce in most mills by 1900. They came from Ireland, Germany, Poland, Hungary, Italy, Slovakia, Croatia, and a dozen other countries. They came because the steel industry advertised in European newspapers that America needed workers and would pay good wages. What the advertisements did not mention was the conditions those wages would be earned under. A Polish worker named Stanislaw Wojciechowski wrote to his family in 1892 describing his first week at a Pittsburgh mill. He said the heat was beyond anything he had imagined. He said men worked like animals, without rest, without mercy. He said he had seen a man burned alive on his second day, and that no one had stopped working while the man screamed. Production continued. The furnaces did not pause for death. Wojciechowski asked his family to pray for him. He said he was not sure he would survive long enough to see them again. His letters stopped in 1894. We don't know what happened to him. He simply vanishes from the historical record, like so many others. The immigrant workforce was deliberately segregated by ethnicity. Mill owners found that workers who could not speak to each other were less likely to organize. A Lithuanian would be placed next to a Croatian, who would be placed next to an Italian. They could not communicate their grievances. They could not plan collective action. They could only work in silence until their bodies gave out. This was called divide and conquer by the labor organizers who tried to breach it. It was remarkably effective. Major strikes required multilingual organizers who could speak to workers in their native tongues. The 1919 steel strike, which involved over 350,000 workers, had to produce leaflets in over 20 languages. Even then, many workers could not be reached. They did not understand what the union was offering. They only knew that if they joined, they might be fired and blacklisted. The blacklist was a weapon of extraordinary power. If a man was known to have union sympathies, his name would be circulated to every major steel company in the region. He would be unable to find work anywhere in the industry. For a man with no other skills and a family to feed, the blacklist was a death sentence. Not a literal death, but the death of any hope for a better life. Some blacklisted workers left the industry entirely. They went west to work in mines or on railroads, which were also dangerous but at least offered fresh employment. Others stayed and worked under assumed names, hoping they would not be recognized. Still others gave up entirely and returned to the countries they had come from, their American dreams destroyed by the same industry that had lured them across the ocean. But that improvement took generations. The men who worked the Bessemer converters in the 1880s did not live to see it. The men who died in the Homestead strike did not live to see it. Hundreds of thousands of workers were sacrificed to build the steel that built America, and most of them went to early graves without even the dignity of being counted. Pittsburgh's steel mills are mostly gone now. The great furnaces have been torn down or converted to museums. The smokestacks that once darkened the sky are rusting monuments to an industry that moved overseas in search of cheaper labor. If you visit the sites of the old mills today, you will find parks, shopping centers, and luxury condominiums. But stand in those places quietly, and you can almost hear it. The volcanic roar of the Bessemer converter, the crash of the overhead cranes, the shouts of men trying to warn each other over noise so loud it damaged hearing permanently, the screams of workers caught by molten steel. The sound that built America was the sound of men being destroyed, and we have never properly acknowledged that debt. The story of American steel is not complete without understanding what happened to the men who walked away. Those who survived their years in the mills did not simply return to normal life. Their bodies carried the evidence of their labor until the day they died. Iron and steel workers developed a distinctive posture as they aged. Years of leaning toward heat sources while shielding their faces with one arm left them with permanently hunched shoulders and necks that tilted slightly to one side. Their skin, exposed to radiant heat for thousands of hours, took on a cooked, leathery quality that no amount of time away from the furnaces could reverse. Cataracts were nearly universal among older workers. The intense light from molten steel damaged their eyes so gradually that many men did not realize they were going blind until they could no longer read a newspaper. Their lungs were the worst of it. Autopsies performed on retired steel workers routinely found lung tissue so scarred and blackened that it looked like the lungs of coal miners. But these men hadn't been underground. They had simply breathed the air of the mills day after day, year after year, until their respiratory systems were permanently compromised. Pneumonia killed them at twice the rate of the general population. Tuberculosis, which needed weakened lungs to take hold, found easy victims among retired steelmen. And then there were the psychological scars. Modern medicine would recognize what many of these workers experienced as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had watched friends die in sudden, violent, horrifying ways. They had heard the screams of men burning to death. They had made split-second decisions about whether to run toward a disaster to help or run away to save themselves. Those memories did not fade with retirement. Wives of steel workers reported that their husbands woke screaming in the night, that they flinched at unexpected loud noises years after leaving the mills, that they could not discuss their working years without trembling. Some drank themselves into early graves. Others simply withdrew, becoming silent and unreachable even to the families who loved them. We know these things not from official records, which rarely bothered to track the long-term health of workers, but from letters, diaries, and oral histories collected by labor historians decades after the fact. The companies that employed these men had no interest in documenting what happened to them after they stopped being productive. They were labor units, not human beings, and labor units do not have biographies. The neighborhoods that surrounded the great mills developed their own culture, shaped by the constant presence of danger and death. Funeral parlors did brisk business. Churches held special services for families of the dead. Widows were so common that they formed informal support networks, helping each other find work and raise children in a world that provided no social safety net. Children grew up knowing that their fathers might not come home. They learned to read their mothers' faces when a mill whistle blew at an unusual hour, because that often signaled an accident. They watched their fathers age prematurely, growing old at 40, dead at 50, and many of them went into the mills themselves because there was no other work available, knowing exactly what awaited them. Generation after generation of families fed themselves to the steel industry. Sons followed fathers, nephews followed uncles. Immigrants stepped off boats and walked directly to the mill gates because someone from their village had written that there was work, and work was all they needed to know. They did not ask about the dangers, or they asked, and the answer was that the money was good, and money was the only thing that mattered when your family was hungry. The money was not actually good. It was survivable. A skilled steel worker in 1890 might earn $2 to $3 per day, which sounds reasonable until you calculate the hours. 12 hours at 20 cents an hour, and 14 hours at 17 cents. These were not wages that built wealth. They were wages that kept families one paycheck away from destitution. When a worker was injured and could not return to his job, the family fell immediately into poverty. When a worker was killed, his widow had perhaps a month before she needed to find income, or her children would starve. The companies understood this desperation and exploited it ruthlessly. If a man complained about conditions, there were 50 immigrants waiting outside the gate who would take his job without complaint. If a man joined a union, he would be blacklisted and unable to find work anywhere in the industry. If a man slowed down, he would be replaced by someone younger and more desperate. This was not an accident. This was a system designed to extract maximum value from human labor with minimum expenditure on that labor's welfare. And it worked brilliantly if your definition of success is measured in tons of steel produced per dollar invested. By 1900, the United States was producing more steel than any nation on Earth. American steel built the skyscrapers that transformed city skylines. It laid the railroads that connected a continent. It forged the warships that projected American power across the globe. The modern world, in a very real sense, was made of American steel. And American steel was made of the broken bodies of working men. The big three steel companies, Jones and Laughlin, U.S. Steel, and Bethlehem Steel, grew into industrial behemoths with market capitalizations that rivaled small nations. Their owners and executives became American aristocracy, building mansions, endowing foundations, marrying their children into European nobility. The Carnegies, the Fricks, the Schwabs, they are names that appear on concert halls and museums and university buildings. The names that do not appear anywhere are the names of the men who made them rich. We do not know all their names. We will never know all their names. Record keeping in the 19th century steel industry was primarily concerned with production figures, not casualty figures. Many mills did not track deaths at all, unless the death occurred in a way that might expose the company to legal liability. Workers who died from long-term exposure to toxic conditions were not counted as industrial fatalities. Workers who died from injuries sustained at work but who made it home before dying were not counted. Workers who survived injuries but could never work again simply disappeared from the records. What we know is this. In the half-century between 1870 and 1920, the American steel industry killed tens of thousands of workers and injured hundreds of thousands more. The exact numbers are impossible to calculate because so many incidents went unrecorded. But every serious historian who has examined the evidence agrees that the death toll was catastrophic by any humane standard. And these deaths were not inevitable. They were not the unavoidable price of progress. They were the result of deliberate choices made by men who prioritized profit over safety. Better equipment existed. It cost money. Better procedures existed. They slowed production. Better training existed. It took time. The owners chose not to implement these improvements because dead workers were cheaper than safe workers. When a man died in a Carnegie mill, the company's cost was a funeral allowance, if the family was lucky, and perhaps a month's wages in compensation. When a man survived because the company invested in safety equipment, the company's cost was the ongoing expense of that equipment plus the wages of a worker who would continue to age, slow down, and eventually need to be replaced anyway. The math was straightforward. Dead workers were a more efficient use of capital than protected workers. This is not speculation. This is documented in the internal correspondence of steel company executives. They knew the human cost of their operations. They calculated it. They considered it an acceptable cost of doing business, and they fought ferociously against any government attempt to impose safety regulations, arguing that such regulations would destroy American competitiveness. The argument sounds familiar because we still hear it today. Anytime a regulation is proposed to protect workers or the environment, someone argues that it will cost jobs and destroy industries. The steel barons made the same argument 130 years ago. They were wrong then, and they are wrong now. The steel industry survived safety regulations. It thrived. The only thing that regulations destroyed was the profit margin that came from treating workers as expendable. But the regulations took too long. The men who worked the Bessemer converters in their most dangerous years did not benefit from them. The men who died at Homestead did not benefit from them. Generations of workers were sacrificed while the nation debated whether human life was worth protecting at the expense of industrial output. We resolved that debate eventually. We decided that workers deserve protection. We created OSHA. We created workers' compensation. We created unions that could fight for safer conditions. But we resolved it too late for the men who built the steel that built America. They are gone now. The last of them died decades ago. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren walk through cities made of steel without knowing what their ancestors paid for those gleaming towers. They cross bridges without thinking about the men who poured the metal that holds those bridges up. They live in a world shaped by steel and have no idea what steel cost. This is why we remember, not to dwell on tragedy for its own sake, but to honor the debt we owe. The highways you drive, the buildings you work in, the appliances you use, all of them trace their lineage back to men who stood 10 feet from liquid metal at 2,900 degrees and hoped today wasn't the day their luck ran out. Their luck ran out more often than we have ever truly acknowledged. The great steel mills of Pittsburgh are museums now. The Bessemer converters that once roared with volcanic fury are silent exhibits. The furnaces that consume men are monuments to an industrial age that most Americans know only from textbooks. I want you to imagine walking through one of those museums. The scale is overwhelming. These machines are huge, far larger than you expected. The converters tower over you like sleeping giants. The furnaces stretch into the distance, their doors gaping open like the mouths of enormous beasts. Now imagine those furnaces lit. Imagine that converter filled with 20 tons of molten iron, blasting air, throwing sparks, roaring so loudly that you cannot hear yourself think. Imagine the heat on your skin from 50 feet away. Imagine being told that your job is to stand 10 feet from that thing and control it. Imagine doing that for 14 hours, every day, for years, knowing that the man who had your job before you died doing it. That is what American industry asked of hundreds of thousands of men. That is what American consumers received unknowingly every time they purchased a product made of steel. That is the foundation upon which modern America was built. We stand on their bones. The bridges they made possible carry us across rivers. The buildings they made possible shelter us from the elements. The infrastructure they made possible delivers water and power and information to our homes. We live in a world they created, and we live longer than they did because we don't have to stand 10 feet from 2,900-degree liquid metal. The least we can do is remember, not the owners, not Carnegie and Frick and Morgan, who took the credit and the profits and the libraries named in their honor. Them we remember plenty. The workers, the laborers, the men whose names we have forgotten or never knew, the men who went into the mills as young and strong as any of us and came out broken, aged, dying, the men who didn't come out at all. They built America, not with speeches or business plans or investment strategies, with their hands, with their bodies, with their lives. This is their story. And if you've made it this far, you're one of the few who knows it. There's a statue at the old Homestead Works site. It shows a steel worker, muscled and determined, gazing toward the river where the Pinkertons came. That July morning in 1892. His name is not on the statue. He represents all of them, which means he represents none of them in particular. But somewhere in old Union records and church registries and immigration documents, his name exists. Their names exist. 10 of thousands of names attached to lives that were cut short or diminished by their service to an industry that did not value them. Maybe someday we'll read those names aloud. All of them. Every man who died in a Pittsburgh mill, or a Gary furnace, or a Bethlehem blast. But maybe we'll build a wall with their names on it, the way we built a wall for the soldiers who died in Vietnam. Maybe we'll treat their sacrifice with the solemnity it deserves. Until then, we have stories like this one. Inadequate, incomplete, but trying to capture something of what they endured. Trying to make you feel, even for a moment, what it was to work in the closest thing to hell that American industry ever created. The next time you cross a steel bridge, think of them. The next time you enter a steel frame building, think of them. The next time you hold a tool made of steel or drive a car built on a steel frame, think of the hands that made the steel that made those things possible. And remember that those hands burned. Those lungs filled with soot. Those eyes went blind from staring at molten metal. Those bodies broke down decades before their time. That is the cost of the modern world. And those men paid it for us.